All right, hello everybody, and welcome to our third and final keynote presentation of the 2021 West Conference. So today, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. David Boyd. So there we go. Dr. David Boyd is one of Canada's leading environmental lawyers and an internationally renowned expert on human rights and environmental justice. He was appointed as the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment for a 3-year term commencing in August 2018. So I believe it's coming, at least this term is coming to an end. I'm not sure if you have a follow-up term. So in this role, he advocates for a healthy and sustainable environment for all. Dr. Boyd holds a PhD in Resource Management and Environmental Studies from the University of British Columbia, a law degree from the University of Toronto, and a business degree from the University of Alberta. So he really couldn't decide where in Canada he wanted to study. Dr. Boyd is an associate professor of law, policy, and sustainability at the University of British Columbia, where his primary focus is on identifying laws and policies that will accelerate the transition to an ecologically sustainable and just future, both in Canada and across the world. His career also includes serving as the executive director of EcoJustice, appearing before the Supreme Court of Canada, and working as a special advisor on sustainability for Canadian Prime Minister Paul Martin. He's advised many governments on environmental, constitutional, and human rights policy, and co-chaired Vancouver's effort to become the world's greenest city by 2020. David has also authored 9 books and more than 100 reports and articles on environmental law and policy, human rights, and constitutional law. So now we'll get to the presentation. And Dr. Boyd has asked that the session is more of a conversation. So please feel free to share your questions in the chat box. And as long as it doesn't get too unwieldy, if you want to raise your hand, we'll let you unmute yourselves. I'll try to moderate that in the session after his initial presentation. All right, so I will stop sharing. And David, take it away.
Well, great. Thanks very much, Carl. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to join you today on the third and final day of your conference. Just to clarify, yeah, I was appointed in 2018 by the UN as the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, and just this past March, the Human Rights Council extended my mandate for another 3 years. So
congrats.
It'll be 6 years. It's definitely the most intensive volunteer experience you can imagine. It involves fielding complaints about alleged human rights violations, conducting country visits to assess human rights compliance, and presenting annual reports to both the Human Rights Council in Geneva and the General Assembly in New York. I've also used the position to intervene in key lawsuits involving human rights and the environment at both the international and national levels in countries ranging from Brazil and Ecuador to Indonesia, Norway, and South Africa. So I'm just going to give you kind of a quick overview of the relationship between the global water crisis and human rights. I'm going to do it quite quickly because I always find that, particularly in today's Zoom heavy world, it's nice to have Q&A sessions where there's more interaction. So just to say at the outset, one of my top priorities in my role as the Special Rapporteur is pursuing a pioneering UN resolution that will recognize for the first time that everyone everywhere has the right to live in a healthy and sustainable environment. This is something that civil society around the world has been working on for almost 30 years, and we're now really close to the finish line. So in pursuit of that goal, I've been preparing a series of reports for the UN on what I call the substantive elements of the right to a healthy environment. So that includes clean air, a safe climate, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, non-toxic environments where people can live, work, study, and play, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, and of course, the subject that we're here to talk about today, safe and sufficient water. I also prepared a report at the Human Rights Council's request on good practices in the implementation of the right to a healthy environment, where I gathered more than 500 good practices from around, from more than 150 nations. So I'm going to give you basically a similar presentation to what I gave to the Human Rights Council in March of this year on the global water crisis, on its impacts on human rights, and what are states' obligations as a result. So as all of you know, water is the lifeblood of human beings and all of life on Earth. Our bodies are 70% water. Our brains, particularly, that's how my brain feels sometimes, 85% water. And aquatic ecosystems purify polluted water, shield coastlines, control erosion, store carbon, and provide such a broad range of services. People depend on clean water for drinking, cooking, cleaning, sanitation, growing food, fishing, recreation, and more. And yet, instead of treating water, this unique, life-supporting, and indispensable substance, with care, respect, and even reverence, humans are polluting surface water and groundwater, using too much water, destroying wetlands, and inflicting catastrophic damage on freshwater ecosystems. And in so doing, undermining water's extraordinary contributions to human health, well-being, and prosperity. In one of the submissions I received in response to a survey I published in advance of my report, a Brazilian indigenous organization told me that, in their words, quote, "Words are lacking to describe the scale of destruction in our territory." And in 2020, for the 8th consecutive year, the World Economic Forum listed water crises as among the top 5 risks to the global economy. So as I said, I gather inputs from organizations, civil society, governments around the world. And in the course of preparing this report, I heard devastating stories from all over the world about people forced to drink dangerously polluted or salty water, people deprived of water by extractive industries, people no longer able to grow their own food or harvest fish, their cultures imperiled by ill-conceived projects ranging from dams and mines to monoculture plantations and fracking, people compelled to migrate by floods, droughts, and other water-related disasters. And I also received numerous accounts of environmental human rights defenders who suffered violence, intimidation, or even criminalization for their courageous efforts to protect water. And I'm just going to run through, you're probably all familiar with these statistics, but these are the statistics on the global situation. Over 2 billion people lack access to safely managed drinking water. Over 4 billion people lack access to safely managed sanitation, a figure which includes over 600 million people who have no access to toilets and are forced to practice open defecation. Water shortages affect, at some time in the year, over 3 billion people. 3/4 of the natural disasters in the last 20 years were water-related, including floods, landslides, and other extreme weather events. At this point, it's estimated that we discharge 80% of wastewater into the environment untreated, again, contaminating surface water, groundwater, soil, and the oceans. Waterborne disease causes nearly 2 million preventable deaths annually, with the greatest burden of those premature deaths falling on children under the age of 5. And we've also seen wildlife populations that depend on freshwater habitats crashing by an average of 80% since 1970. Add on top of that climate change as a risk multiplier, which exacerbates the impacts of pollution, scarcity, and water-related disasters. So that's enough of the statistics. I want to just take a break and tell a story. As I mentioned earlier, one of my jobs as the special rapporteur is to do country missions. And my first 2 country missions, I wanted to visit countries, one country that was really at the forefront of being impacted by climate change, and one country where there are also climate change impacts, but they're a major fossil fuel producer. So I went to Fiji and I went to Norway. And Fiji was really kind of a life-changing experience because I did get to meet people who really, their lives have been completely turned upside down because of climate change. I visited a village called Vunidogoloa, which was one of the first communities in the world that had to be completely relocated because of climate change. And this was a formerly waterfront. I mean, if you imagine in your mind what the tropical paradise of Fiji looks like, this would be it. You know, beautiful beach, palm trees, and people had been living there for hundreds of years, many, many generations. But because of rising sea levels, increasing storm surges, saltwater contamination of both their drinking water supply and the lands where they were growing foods, it became untenable for them to live there. And so the people of Vunidogoloa moved about 3 kilometers inland. And obviously, you know, it's a steep, there is a trail, it's a steep trail, it's hot and humid. And so older people and others with disabilities are no longer able to get to the ocean, which is, you know, for their entire lives been the heart of their culture, the heart of their economy, the source of their food. So, you know, devastating impacts on their lives and their human rights. And also in Fiji, they were hit by Tropical Cyclone Winston in 2016, which at the time was the strongest tropical cyclone to ever reach land in the Southern Hemisphere, with wind speeds of over 330 kilometers per hour, which is just about impossible to imagine. If you recall that huge windstorm we had here on the West Coast about 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago now, That was wind speeds of around 120 kilometers an hour at maximum. So, almost unfathomable to imagine more than 2 times that. Anyways, that tropical cyclone, fortunately, it hit the side of Fiji with less people, but it did cause about 70 deaths and thousands of people were left homeless. And so some of those homeless people have migrated to live in what the government calls informal settlements, what I would call slums, on the outskirts of Suva, the capital of Fiji. And I visited 2 of these settlements, one just beside a river, one just beside the ocean. And people are living in really rough conditions. I mean, houses built from plywood and sheet metal. They do have electricity, but definitely challenges with respect to drinking water and sanitation. And, in both of these communities, they experience floods. So, by the river, by the sea, the king tides are higher than they've ever been. And the floods actually are washing excrement out of the pit toilets and causing cholera. So Fiji's a middle income nation, but they have one of the world's highest rates of cholera. And, you can trace these impacts back to climate change, but they're waterborne diseases. So when we talk about the global water crisis and the impact on human rights, I think it's really important to remember that these are people, these are families, these are communities that are being impacted. Now, there is actually a different special rapporteur whose focus is specifically on safe drinking water and sanitation. And that special rapporteur has done terrific work, primarily focusing on the services, water-related services, including provision of safe drinking water and adequate sanitation. For my report, I wanted to take a broader approach and look at water pollution, water scarcity, water-related disasters, and damage to healthy freshwater ecosystems. Because these water-related problems have impacts on the right to life, the right to health, obviously the rights to water and sanitation, but also the right to food, the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to development, the right to culture, and the right to a healthy environment, as well as Indigenous people's rights and the rights of the child. And the impacts of these water-related problems, they do tend to fall disproportionately upon communities and individuals who are already vulnerable or marginalized because of their age, gender, poverty, indigeneity, disabilities, and cultural or ethnic background. Now, the one thing I will say is that although these communities and individuals are at risk, they also have the potential to contribute to solutions when they're empowered to do so. And so, for example, there's terrific evidence about how women are key actors in improving the way that water is used, allocated and managed. And so a couple of examples of where the right to a healthy environment has been used to address some of these water-related problems and human rights impacts. One famous court case from the Philippines where a good friend of mine, Tony Aposa, brought a lawsuit arguing that the severe pollution in Manila Bay in the Philippines violated the constitutionally protected right to a healthy environment. That case was decided by the Supreme Court of the Philippines in 2008, and the court ordered 13 different government agencies to take specific actions to clean up and restore the ecological integrity of Manila Bay. Now, that's a challenge that is ongoing 13 years later. There's been some progress made because of that court decision, but there's still a lot of work to do. A more inspiring example comes from Argentina, where a woman by the name of Beatriz Mendoza, who is actually a public healthcare worker, she moved to a very poor and polluted community in the capital of Buenos Aires. This would be about almost 20 years ago. And she soon became ill. So she went to see her doctor, and her doctor said, well, yes, there's contaminants in your blood, and this is because you're living in this community on the banks of the heavily polluted Riachuelo River with high levels of air pollution. And so the doctor recommended that she move. But Beatriz Mendoza didn't move. She got a bunch of neighbors together, they hired a lawyer, and they filed a lawsuit against the federal, provincial, and municipal governments in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, as well as 44 of the largest polluting corporations in that watershed, alleging that this chronic and severe pollution was a violation of their right to a healthy environment. That case was decided by the Supreme Court of Argentina in 2008, and the Supreme Court, again, made a very detailed order requiring government agencies to collaborate in cleaning up the problem. To date, they've spent over $2 billion in responding to that court order. They have built new safe drinking water infrastructure, new wastewater treatment infrastructure. They have done an extensive job of cleaning the Riachuelo River. They have built new waste management systems. They've built some regional healthcare, environmental healthcare clinics. They've built new parks and pathways along the banks of the river. And it's really quite extraordinary to see the change that's taken place. So that really reflects the power of human rights to bring about positive changes. When you have human rights, you also have responsibilities. And so in order to comply with their human rights obligations, I called upon states to take a rights-based approach to all aspects of allocating, managing, conserving, protecting, and restoring water. Taking this rights-based approach has multiple benefits. It clarifies the obligations of states and businesses. It emphasizes the need for capacity building, and it prioritizes improving conditions for the poorest and most vulnerable people. Those people can be empowered to become involved in designing and implementing solutions. So I actually put forward 7 key steps that all states should take to fulfill their human rights obligations. The first is to prepare a state of the water assessment, which includes information on water quality, sources of pollution, water supply, water users, and impacts on human rights, human health, and ecosystems. So that's the first step. The second step is to conduct a legal mapping initiative to make sure that human rights are incorporated in water and wastewater laws, regulations, and policies, and to ensure that human rights are prioritized in water allocation decisions. Third, states should develop or revise water-related plans to incorporate a rights-based approach. So those could be integrated water management plans or drinking water safety plans. Fourth, implement those plans and enforce the water-related laws, regulations, and standards. And fifth, evaluate progress and, if necessary, strengthen actions to ensure that human rights are fulfilled. Now, there's 2 additional actions that have to be taken at every step of this process, which are building financial, human, and institutional capacity, and informing and engaging the public with a particular emphasis on women, youth, and other potentially vulnerable and marginalized groups. My report contains extensive examples of good practices. So this is something I like to really present both to the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly to illustrate that this can be done well. At the international level, there are lots of regional agreements for transboundary cooperation. You know, Canada has the Boundary Waters Treaty with the United States. In South America, there's the Guarani Aquifer Agreement involving Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay. And there's an agreement in Southern Africa for management of the Stampede transboundary aquifer, which involves Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa. So there's transboundary treaties at the United Nations level that are intended to assist countries in reaching those types of cooperative agreements. Then at the national level, some of the good practices that I highlighted include countries that have provided constitutional protection for water. So Croatia, Egypt, Slovenia, and Uruguay. Countries with strong laws governing the water sector, like the National Water Act in South Africa. Policies that specifically empower women, like the Rural Water Supply Policy in Nepal, and innovative approaches to conserving water and recycling wastewater, such as those used in Singapore and Jordan. I have a whole bunch of detailed recommendations in my report that I'm not going to go into about protecting and improving water quality, preventing and alleviating water scarcity, improving water governance, preventing water-related disasters and improving resilience, and achieving water and climate co-benefits. Just too many of those to even I begin describing. And so in conclusion, you know, when we consider the devastating impacts of the global water crisis on people's lives, people's health, and human rights, it's clear that we need to take remedial actions rapidly and systematically, again, placing a priority on improving conditions for the most vulnerable. Fulfilling the rights to water, sanitation, and a healthy environment are essential prerequisites for achieving the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals. And these problems of pollution, scarcity, and water-related disasters, the good news is that they are largely preventable. We have solutions in hand: rights-based water and wastewater laws, standards and policies, capacity building programs, improved technologies, and enhanced accountability mechanisms. investment in sustainable water governance and infrastructure is going to have to be scaled up substantially. And yet the benefits of these investments in safe, sufficient water and healthy aquatic ecosystems, the benefits are immense. The World Health Organization estimates that we get $4 to $5 in benefits for every dollar invested in water. And when you bring the human rights perspective, one of the big value added aspects of that is that making these investments is an obligation on governments. It's not an option. They have obligations in order to fulfill the human rights of both present and future generations. And so a human rights perspective at the end of the day is really a catalyst for accelerating action to achieve safe and sufficient water, to empower those working to protect and conserve water, and to guide our actions towards a healthy and sustainable future. If we look at the UN, which passed resolutions on the right to water for the first time in 2010, those resolutions from the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council have been a catalyst for some countries to change their constitutions, their highest and strongest laws, to include the right to water. Countries such as Costa Rica, Fiji, Mexico, and Slovenia. And in those countries, things have changed on the ground as well. I was talking to someone from Slovenia who said that constitutional recognition of the right to water has really made a difference for Roma communities who previously didn't have access to safe drinking water. Other countries like France have changed laws to incorporate the right to water. And then there are many countries where these UN resolutions were a catalyst for change. Canada being one of those countries. Canada, which for a long time rejected the idea that there was a human right to water. And when the United Nations voted on that in 2010, Canada abstained from that vote. But several years later, once the resolutions were passed, Canada changed positions, recognized the right to water. And I think that has been one of the factors, one of many factors influencing the government's long overdue, but encouraging commitment to delivering safe drinking water and sanitation to remote Indigenous communities. Over the past 6 years, the government has spent several $1 billion, has ended long-term boil water advisories on affecting more than 100 Indigenous communities in Canada. There's still work to be done, but that's an encouraging sign of progress. And also with this COVID pandemic that we've all been suffering from for the last 16 or 17 months, there were countries like Colombia in Latin America that on the basis of the right to water passed, for example, Colombia passed a presidential decree which prevented utilities from cutting off water even if people weren't paying their utility bills. So those are just a few examples of how these UN resolutions, which may seem fairly abstract, can actually make a difference. And that's why I'm working as hard as I can to try and get a UN resolution recognizing the right to a healthy environment, because I believe that will have a similar catalytic impact on nations who will strengthen constitutions, legislation, and most importantly, actions on the ground. We live in a pretty daunting global environmental crisis, but I believe that taking a rights-based approach, not just to water, but to air, to food, to climate change, to biodiversity, a rights-based approach really, when you add human rights to environmental law, you get magic, you get accountability. And so that's really my message to you is I hope all of you will, in your work in the coming years, take this message to heart that all of us have the right to live in a healthy environment, and we all should be acting to fulfill our responsibilities to protect the environment. So I'll stop there and open us up to questions. And thanks very much for listening.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, that was a great discussion about what it is you've been thinking about over the last 3 years, and now for the next 3 years as well. Yeah. So I'll start off with a question I have, and there's a bunch coming into the chat box here. But so you mentioned, I believe it was the Fijian community that had to move physically due to whatever we'll call it climate change impacts and whatnot. But so I'm wondering from kind of an international government standpoint, what are some of the low-hanging fruits that we can do to improve resilience to climate change impacts on water resources? Yeah, things that international bodies like the UN or national governments can do to help groups around the world.
Yeah, well, so the first thing I will say is that one of the most important things the UN can do through these resolutions is recognize that everyone has the right to live in a healthy and sustainable environment, which in and of itself doesn't have the impacts that you're speaking of, Carl, but which is a catalyst for action to address those types of issues. The other thing which is really critical at the kind of global level is for wealthy nations to step up to the plate and fulfill the commitment they made in 2015 in Paris when the Paris Agreement was negotiated, a commitment to mobilize at least $100 billion in funding for adaptation in low and middle income nations. So again, that's a broad strokes action, but it's critically important that it be taken. And while we're talking about climate change, I think it's also really important. So climate change, there are three main pillars of action. One is mitigation, which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions and enhancing carbon sinks. And obviously, much more needs to be done with respect to mitigation to comply with what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said is necessary to avoid temperature increases of more than 1.5 or 2 degrees. So mitigation number one, we have our work cut out for us. States are making more ambitious commitments, and some countries actually are making progress. Number two is adaptation, which I've mentioned. And then the third pillar, which is often overlooked, but is actually quite relevant to this discussion, is something called loss and damage. And loss and damage is intended to compensate small island developing states and low income countries for damage that they have already suffered. So this isn't something that they can adapt to. This is damages that have already been suffered because of climate change. And although states have done a fairly decent, although not complete job of mobilizing funds for adaptation, at the United Nations, countries have been discussing loss and damage since 1992 when the Framework Convention on Climate Change was negotiated. And I think it's really shocking and embarrassing as a member of a wealthy nation to learn that not a single penny has changed hands under the pillar of loss and damage in 30 years. Discussions are ongoing. In Glasgow this fall, there will be more talks about loss and damage. But the small island developing states themselves have put forward what I think are absolutely compelling proposals. The Marshall Islands has proposed a levy on international shipping. The Maldives has proposed an international air travel levy. And so those are financial mechanisms which collectively would raise literally tens of billions of dollars every year, which would effectively be a wealth transfer from the North to the global South. And yet, as we stand today, neither of those proposals has been accepted, let alone implemented.
That's a really interesting idea. I hadn't previously heard of that. Let me just follow up one question that you mentioned. I think it was 1992 in that resolution. Is that considered as the base year? Because if you're talking about losses and damages, is that how the framework is set up, like relative to a starting point? Or is there a different approach taken for how climate change can cause losses and damages?
Well, 1992 was in some ways is a base year because that's when nations, almost every nation in the world became a party to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, in which one of the key commitments under that convention was, and this is a direct quote, to quote, avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference with the Earth's climate system, right? So from that point on, that commitment was made. That was an international environmental commitment. Unfortunately, this is really the Achilles heel of international environmental laws that even with the nationally determined contributions that states agreed to put forward under the Paris Agreement, there's no way to hold them accountable. So if Canada says, and Canada has done this repeatedly since 1992, we say we're going to reduce our emissions X% by 2020 or 2025 or 2030, and then we don't live up to that commitment, there is no accountability mechanism under these international environmental laws. But that's where human rights comes into the picture. International human rights law provides accountability, provides remedies, provides a whole system that can foster accountability. And so that's what we saw 2 years ago in the Urgenda decision from the Netherlands, where a group of 900 citizens from the Netherlands sued their own government saying, our government is not taking sufficiently ambitious climate action. And the Supreme Court of the Netherlands said, you're right, the government is violating your rights under the European Convention on Human Rights and has an obligation to cut emissions faster and deeper. And so the government of the Netherlands responded to that court decision by closing a coal-fired power plant that had been built just 5 years earlier, investing billions of euros in renewable energy, putting solar panels on the roof of all the schools in the Netherlands, imposing lower speed limits on traffic, and a host of other measures to achieve faster, deeper reductions cuts. Just last month in Germany, the Constitutional Court of Germany said that based on human rights, the government of Germany needs to both improve its short-term climate target and its long-term climate target. And the government of Germany, to their credit, has already responded to that court decision. So I think it's really instructive to think about how human rights approaches can provide accountability that's missing when we just look at things from an environmental lens.
Okay, thanks. We'll get going in the chat box here. So the first question came from Ta. She said, thank you, David. Two related questions. Maybe we'll just get to the first now, and then maybe we'll circle back to the second. So the first question, could you speak to the efforts to institutionalize the rights of nature? So example, a river as a legal person, and I think it was in New Zealand who was kind of pioneering that. So could you speak to the efforts to institutionalize the rights of nature and mechanisms to support those efforts at the international level, or what is needed to happen if such support is currently lagging?
Sure, great question, Ta, thank you. So recognizing the rights of nature is something that really it's been talked about, and in fact, rights for nature and responsibilities towards nature are part of indigenous legal systems dating back thousands and thousands of years. But from a Western perspective, it was really Ecuador in 2008, which was undergoing a process of constitutional renewal, and Ecuador decided to put the rights of nature, or Pachamama, as they say in Quechua, into its constitution. And so that really kind of brought a lot of attention to this concept of legal rights for nature, surprising a lot of people because we think of rights as human rights. But in fact, in our legal system, corporations have rights, municipalities have rights. We can use laws to assign rights to different types of entities. And so after that pioneering breakthrough in Ecuador, Bolivia passed a law called the Law on the Rights of Mother Earth. We've seen court decisions in Colombia, Mexico, India, Bangladesh. Uganda has amended its national environmental legislation to recognize the rights of nature. New Zealand, Carl, as you mentioned, has passed 2 laws which recognize the rights of particular entities, in one case a river, and in the other case an ecosystem that was formerly known as a national park. And so and in Canada, actually, just within the past year, 2 indigenous communities, one in British Columbia, one in Quebec, have passed their own laws recognizing the rights, in both cases, of rivers. The Fraser River in the case of the Chilcotin First Nation in BC, and the Magpie River in Quebec. So this is an idea that's really gaining momentum around the world. At the international or UN level, the United Nations has a really great initiative called the Harmony with Nature Initiative. And they've got a terrific website that kind of keeps track of all of these recognitions of rights of nature around the world. There was an effort to get the rights of nature recognized in the 2020 declaration that came out of the World Environment Summit in South Africa. There's a reference to it. But I would say that although we're quite close to getting the UN to recognize the human right to a healthy environment, we're a further distance in terms of recognition at the global level of the rights of nature.
Great, thanks. Next question comes from a different David. He's asked, do you know of any examples where industrial water use and the rights to healthy water in the environment are able to successfully coexist? And then the interesting second part here, and how can we have these systems that are resilient to changes in government? So he said, how do you avoid yo-yoing regulations when government changes around having this coexistence of industrial water use and the right to healthy water in the environment?
Right. Yeah. Good questions from another David. There are many of us. So there are many countries in the world where industrial water use does coexist with the right to water and the right to a healthy environment. I think that it's, from a human rights perspective, it's really clear in law that where the right to water is legally recognized, then it must be given priority over all other uses. So the human right to water, which includes some, that includes water for cooking, cleaning, drinking, etc. Also, in terms of the priorities, it also includes water for growing food. So because there's also a human right to food, that takes priority. And then water for industrial purposes is down the line. But they can coexist. And so, I mentioned I did a country visit to Norway, and Norway has a system where everyone has access to safe drinking water of very high quality. And then because that right is fulfilled, then there's right, and they do a really strong job in Norway of regulating industrial water use. So as long as you've recognized the priority of the human access to water, and then you take steps to regulate the industrial use of water in such a way that it doesn't adversely impact upon human health or on ecosystem health, then I think those two things can coexist. The question about yo-yoing regulations, that's something that's a big problem in the United States, where there's such polarization in the political arena. And I think one of the strongest ways to avoid yo-yoing is to entrench human rights in constitutions. Constitutions are the strongest and highest laws of every country in the world, and generally speaking are the most difficult laws to change. So if you look at the United States Constitution, there's only been 20 odd amendments to that Constitution over the course of 250 years or something. So that's one way to really avoid that yo-yoing. I think another way, which is not as legally oriented, but I think that something we haven't talked about today is the critical importance of ecological education, right? So, we really have, one of the problems that we face today is that we have currently a generation of political leaders who are, quite frankly, illiterate when it comes to ecological considerations. And so certainly that was the case during the previous American administration. And so I think that ecological education has to be right on par with reading, writing, and arithmetic. There's no reason those four things shouldn't be given equal status. And again, there are some countries, particularly in Scandinavia, where that is actually the law, that from kindergarten right through university, you have to be given an ecological education. It's also part of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child that every child has the right to an ecological education. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I like that idea about the ecological education. That was kind of the first thing that my mind perhaps jumped to. And I was going to ask you to give an example of somewhere that does it, but you mentioned that. So, and I guess, drew a parallel to perhaps in Canada, how the education system is including the history of colonial history in Canada, and perhaps is going to have some further updates and reforms over the coming years. Especially, I know it has since I was in grade school some years ago. But
same here, for sure.
All right, so the next question comes from Bree. She says, "Hi, David. Thanks so much. I have a question about your reporting at the UN level. You mentioned many integrated ecological and human rights challenges, from air quality, water quality, quantity, and development. Within your position, do you have the opportunity to integrate these different challenges and solutions? Also, do you leave your country visits making specific recommendations?"
Yeah, thanks, Bree. So, well, I'm putting forward this series of reports on the substantive elements of the right to a healthy environment, which, although each is dealing with specific issues, I make it clear that these issues are interconnected. So, the very first report I did on clean air is integrally and intimately connected with climate change. And you can't really solve either of those problems without addressing them both. And in fact, you get co-benefits from doing it in an integrated fashion. Similarly, with the water report, there's all kinds of solutions where you can get benefits in terms of the human right to water, which also benefit biodiversity and also have climate benefits. So yes, for sure, to integrated solutions. In terms of the country visits, I have to say this is one of the most intense things that I do as a special rapporteur. The country visits to Fiji and Norway were both 2 weeks long. I can't remember how many meetings exactly I had in Norway, but in the space of 2 weeks in Fiji, I did 4 different site visits and had over 60 meetings. And then on the last day of my visit, and this is the way the system works, on the last day of your visit, you're expected to host a press conference and release preliminary findings. So it's super intense, super daunting. And Fiji and Norway, I guess, are kind of easy countries, if you will, like, because they're relatively small But my friend Leo Heller did a country visit to India. He was the former special rapporteur on the rights to water and sanitation. And he said basically just, it's impossible, right? He was there for 2 weeks. He flew all over the place. He met with like hundreds of different people. And then he had a press conference and released his preliminary findings. So, and then you do get to actually go back and think about it before you have a period of months before you have to actually formally present your final report to the Human Rights Council. But it's a bit of a crazy system. And it's actually unfortunate in a way that they only let us do 2 country visits per year, because it's a really critical part of the experience. The Norwegian country visit was also super fascinating. I mean, I spent 3 days north of the Arctic Circle, spending time with the Sami indigenous people whose lives are being, again, like incredible, the impact of climate change, right? So the Sami indigenous people, they span Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Russia. And for centuries, if not millennia, they have depended on reindeer herding for their culture, their economy, their way of life. And because of climate change, during the winter, what is happening now, even above the Arctic Circle in Norway, is for hundreds of years, they've had snow and snow and snow and snow. And reindeer have evolved to be able to scrape away the snow to get at the lichens that they eat to sustain themselves over the winter. Now they get a mix of snow and rain. And so they get these layers of ice, which the hooves of the reindeer simply can't get through. So they've had some mass starvation incidents. These are free-ranging reindeer. And so now the Sami are having to, buy snowmobiles, figure out ways they can get out and feed the reindeer during the winter, which they have never had to do in the past. And so when I came to the end of my Norway visit, I said, and Norway, to be clear and to be fair, Norway is a world leader in terms of sustainable electricity. They get over 99% of their electricity from renewable sources. They're #1 in the world in terms of electric vehicle sales because of some really creative public policies. They're more generous than any other country in the world in assisting low-income states that have tropical forests to protect those forests. And there's many things Norway's doing from a human rights and environment perspective that deserve praise. But at the same time, Norway is one of the world's leading producers and exporters of oil and gas. And so in my press conference, I said that Norway faces this paradox of being progressive in many ways, but contributing to the very problems that they're trying to solve at the same time. And so it was fairly controversial. I said that Norway should begin a plan to phase out oil and gas production. I received hate mail, death threats, you name it, as a result of those recommendations. But I also received a lot of positive feedback that controversial conclusion sparked much needed discussions in Norway. So, you kind of live by the sword, die by the sword, I guess.
Wow, great story. Aline has a question, and this is a good one that perhaps we glossed over at the beginning. She says the right to water is such an interesting concept. Does it mean that I have the right to go down to the ocean with a bucket and access water, or does it mean I have the right to receive potable water piped into my home? So do I have does somebody have to deliver this water to me in the most convenient way, or do I just have access to it? So perhaps you could touch on that.
Yeah, so this is really something that the Special Rapporteur on the Rights to Water and Sanitation has articulated in great detail, that the right to water means that water has to be accessible, affordable, adequate quality and quantity. And the burden really does lie upon the state to fulfill those commitments. It doesn't mean that, but I guess the thing about all human rights is that, well, they're not absolute. So that means that, let's say I wanted to move to somewhere in northeastern British Columbia, 100 kilometers from the nearest community. I couldn't then write a letter to the government of BC and say, hey, can you build the pipeline, extend the pipes to my house because I want you to fulfill my right to water. That's not how it works. So for example, in South Africa, where the Constitution recognizes the right to water, there was a famous lawsuit brought by some poor people in Johannesburg who were arguing that the system that the municipal utility company had going there, which involved people sharing water from a standpipe located near their residence, and having to pay in advance for their water, those conditions were not actually meeting the qualities of accessibility, affordability, et cetera, that are part of the right to water. And that case went to the highest court, the Constitutional Court of South Africa. And the Constitutional Court, I think in a decision that surprised and disappointed a lot of people, said, look, the government's obligation is not to ensure that everybody has crystal clear drinking water coming out of their taps tomorrow. The government's obligation is to apply their maximum available resources to progressively fulfilling the right to water. And so that, in terms of these social, economic, and cultural rights, that's the difference between economic, social, and cultural rights on the one hand, is that they're subject to this concept of progressive realization, and international or civil and political rights like the right to vote, the right to life, which are immediately realizable. That you can't have like progressive realization of the right to life. It's immediately in effect. So that is hopefully an answer to that question. I mean, I do have to just comment on the question about taking a bucket to the ocean, because 10 years ago, I did some research into the situation that Indigenous communities in Canada were facing in terms of their access to safe drinking water and adequate sanitation. And it was absolutely shocking what I learned about communities right across this beautiful country of ours, where Indigenous people, the original inhabitants of this land, did not have, I mean, they were literally, for example, the Garden Hill First Nation in northern Manitoba, 10,000 people, fewer than half of them had access to any kind of drinking water on their premises. So they were, and this is northern Manitoba, they were taking sleds out to the lake, they would cut a hole in the ice, and they would put a bucket into the hole, take that bucket of water back to their homes. And so that, you know, I wrote an article for the McGill Law Journal about that, which argued that this was a violation of their rights under the Canadian Constitution. And I was hoping that some more well-resourced and effective lawyers than me would take up that article and use it to sue the government of Canada. There were threats. Certainly some First Nations made threats to sue the government about safe drinking water, but now there's progress being made. So that's encouraging. And I will say there's also a class action lawsuit brought by a number of First Nations seeking billions of dollars in damages from the government of Canada for failing to deliver that basic and essential human right, that service of safe drinking water. So it's those class action lawsuits are in an early stage, but it'll be super interesting to see what courts make of them, or whether the government settles those claims out of court.
Yeah, that is interesting, and I have read over the briefs for those class action lawsuits, so we'll see how that plays out. I'm going to jump out of order here because Karen just posted a very interesting question right at the bottom, and I understand we only have about 10 minutes left. They say, thanks for a great talk, Dr. Boyd. Do you think human rights to a healthy environment is an intergenerational issue where the government is a trustee for the unborn generation?
Oh yeah, so I love this topic. So what are the rights of future generations? And I think that this is a kind of interesting topic from an abstract legal perspective. What are the rights of future generations? It does get a little bit tricky because you can get mixed up with the right to life movement, you know, the anti-abortion movement saying, you know, the fetus has a right to life. So how can we talk about the abstract rights of future generations if we're not willing to talk about the rights of an unborn fetus? That's, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but I do think that children that are alive today are effectively future generations. And so that's actually where I'm putting, when I work on this topic, I really look at what are the rights of children. And children and youth, of course, are so incredible in their the power they've brought to the global climate justice movement. When I first started as special rapporteur, I worked with a group of children and youth from around the world to start something called the Children's Environmental Rights Initiative. And it's actually my favorite part of being the special rapporteur is I get to hang out with these kids who are just unbelievably passionate, articulate, eloquent. Last week I was in a session with, and this is something we need to do in Canada. Last week I was in a session with 5 kids from the Scottish Children's Parliament. So these were girls and boys aged 9 to 13 who who are elected members of this Scottish Children's Parliament and working on a brief about climate change to the government of Scotland. And if you look at that, I'm not sure I mentioned it, but last month there was a court decision by the Constitutional Court in Germany in a case that was brought by not only young people in Germany, but young people in Nepal and Bangladesh as well, arguing that the German government has to do more to address climate change. And the German Constitutional Court, they didn't specifically say that future generations have rights, but what they did say is that the German government's inadequate action on climate change threatened today's children with what the court called radical deprivation in the decades ahead. Radical deprivation in the sense that these today's children and youth will not be able to undertake activities that release greenhouse gas emissions because the government of Germany is basically saying, we'll reduce our emissions later. And so that's really quite a striking concept for a court to have articulated, radical deprivation of today's children and youth. And yet, if you look at climate science and the failure to address emissions today, that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about a future of potential radical deprivation. So I think that talking about children's rights is super powerful. There's children, COVID kind of put a plug in the street protests, but children have continued to be powerful activists for change. Just last week, this is actually good news from kind of a wonky UN perspective. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child last week announced that they are going to do something called a general comment on children's rights, the environment, and climate change. And basically this means authoritative legal guidance on states' obligations vis-a-vis children in the context of environment and climate change. So that's something that'll take probably 18 to 24 months to come up with, but then that will provide really clear information to governments on what they have to do differently. And then there are amazing lawsuits being brought all over the world by children and youth. I'm involved in one that was brought by Greta Thunberg and 15 other young people against the governments of Argentina, Brazil, France, Germany, and Turkey before the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. We just had arguments in that, oral arguments in that case a couple of weeks ago. My favorite case, though, is a Colombian case where 25 children and youth in Colombia sued their government. And I mean, what a thing for kids to be able to do, to sue their own government. They sued the government of Colombia for failing to stop deforestation in the Colombian portion of the Amazon rainforest. That case went to the Supreme Court of Colombia, and the Supreme Court of Colombia said these kids are absolutely right, that their right to a healthy environment, because of the climate change implications, because of the biodiversity implications, because of the Amazon's importance for water, their rights being violated. And they said to the government of Colombia, sit down with these kids, bring in the best and brightest scientists from Colombia's universities, and come up with a plan to end deforestation in our portion of the Amazon. So I just love what children and young people are doing. It's super inspiring. Doesn't mean that us old folks are off the hook, but it's really great to collaborate with children and youth. And one of the things that I pledge to them whenever I meet with them is that I'll do everything I can to amplify their voices. And so each of my reports, I actually include specific quotations from kids that I've met and talked to about the various themes.
Okay, thank you. I'll have the last question from Rudri, maybe in 1 or 2 minutes, and then I'll wrap everything up. So Rudri says, thank you for the talk, David. I was curious about how the UN deals with or convinces nations that are, for whatever reason, are hesitant on adopting the human rights-based approach to water and the environment. Perhaps you can talk specifically about Canada. You mentioned at the beginning Canada was hesitant about this and something changed. But how can the UN convince, or what tools are there to get countries to adopt this human right?
Yeah, great question, Rudri. So, in Canada's case, so when the UN Human Rights Council or the General Assembly passes a resolution, those resolutions are not legally binding. So like I couldn't, after 2010, when the UN recognized the right to water, I couldn't go to a court in Canada and say, hey, the UN has recognized my right to water. Now the government of Canada has to do something. But they do kind of set a normative standard. So it was really those, and that was a process of about 15 years of civil society organizations from around the world pressuring governments to recognize the right to water. The UN created a special rapporteur on the rights to water and sanitation to bring more attention to it, to do homework on what it actually involved. And so, that special rapporteur did a series of reports. They were working towards, they were slowly, and so the thing you have to remember about the UN is it's a member-driven organization, 193 countries. So, it's challenging to get all of those countries on board, and luckily it does not operate by consensus. So that process was moving forward towards the goal of a UN resolution. Germany and Spain were spearheading that process, but they were really dragging their feet, and Canada was helping them to drag their feet by saying, no, we shouldn't be talking about this as a human right. There's no precedent for it, blah, blah, blah. Canada was like definitely a black knight in this situation. And interestingly enough, it was one country, Bolivia, that got tired of the heel dragging, tired of the delay, and just took it to the United Nations General Assembly and said, normally these things have a process. We're tired of this endless process. We just want to have a vote. And so they brought it to a vote in the General Assembly in July of 2010. And because it passed with I think about 120 countries voting in favor, only a handful voting against, and a bunch, including Canada, taking kind of the easy way out and abstaining from voting. Once it's passed, then countries that kind of respect the rule of law, respect the United Nations, they kind of tend to go along with it. So that's one way that the system works, is even though Canada didn't want to go along with it, we kind of felt like maybe we should. And so that resulted in us changing our perspective. Another way that my office can actually help is anybody in the world can file what's called a communication, or it's basically like a complaint with me saying, my government and these businesses are not respecting my right to a healthy environment or my right to water. And they have to provide the facts and sources of information. I take that information and then I can write a letter to the government and say, hey, here are these allegations. Can you please explain yourself? And then, put out a press release. And so it's kind of like I don't have any power at the end of the day to order the government to do anything, but some governments are quite sensitive to that kind of international pressure. So a great example of this, I got contacted by people in Colombia from the Wayu indigenous community. These are indigenous people who have been living there for thousands of years, and they now are living adjacent to one of the world's largest open pit coal mines, which has contaminated their water, contaminated their air, caused incredible adverse impacts on their health, their rights. So they got in touch with me. I wrote a quite harsh letter to the government of Colombia, put out a press release saying that they should suspend operations at this open pit coal mine. I mean, it's just completely immoral, right? Here they are extracting billions of dollars of wealth, and you have people living in some of the most horrific poverty that I've ever seen in my life. And it really upset the government of Colombia to have the headline in the Colombian newspapers was United Nations says that El Cerrejón, the mine, should close down. So, it's not like I'm really the United Nations, but that's one tool that we have at our disposal. So, and we do, like, there's 44 of us who are serving as special rapporteurs on different topics. We do literally hundreds and hundreds of communications every year against countries all over the world.
Okay, thank you so much. I love all the stories that you're able to bring to these discussions, and that's something you're able to bring to the various talks I've heard from you over the last few years. It's great to put a face and a story and to all the things you're talking about. So thank you very much. I got reminded from our publicity people that we need to take a group photo. So everybody in the session, if you can turn your cameras on, please. This will be, actually, no, it won't be the last one of the session. We'll do one this evening again, but because we're all virtual, we can't take a picture just in the audience. So cameras on. There's 9 cameras. Come on, there's more people. There we go.
Now you see how many people are just actually eating lunch and.
Yeah. Okay, another second here. Cameras on. Okay, we could, come on, let's fill at least one screen. There's a bunch of you sitting with your cameras off. Couple more. Okay. Right, no camera. Okay, all right, 3, 2, 1. Perfect. Okay, well, yeah, thank you very much, David, for everyone who participated in the discussion today. So the West Conference will take a break for the next few hours before coming together tonight for our final event, which is the virtual banquet from 5 to 7 p.m. in Vancouver this evening. And we invite everyone to join us for the lighthearted chat that we'll have with everybody involved and your fellow water researchers. So with that, I would like to bring to a close the main portion of the 2021 West Conference. So 3 days ago, we opened the conference by explaining that West aims to create a space for global water conversations. This week, we were joined by over 250 water professionals from around Canada and the world. You can see that on the map that we had. And we are very thankful to all of our speakers, panelists, judges, and especially to all of our participants for making West the event that it was. Thank you all. We also like to thank our sponsors, the UBC Alma Mater Society, UBC Applied Science, the Chemical and Biological Engineering, as well as Civil Engineering, UBC Future Waters, and the Canadian Association for Water Quality, who all contributed financially. So thank you. And I'd like to close this session with the same vision that I opened the conference with. And that's that solving the future water challenges will require a necessarily interdisciplinary approach. We each bring a unique academic and cultural background to the discussion, and each voice must be valued in the decision-making process. So I hope that at West this week, you were able to learn about a perspective that you had previously not known, and that you were able to meet someone who you wouldn't normally have bumped into. And that's the strength of diversity, and diversity is at the core of the West Conference. So thank you all for participating. We look forward to seeing you later tonight at the banquet, and again at West 2022.